Okay, so let's get started. Today we begin a new book, the last book of the Torah, of the 5 books of Moses. And this book is completely different from the books that went before, for the simple reason that in this book, almost the entire book is Moses talking. It is a book that almost entirely written in first person. Moses addresses the nation. It's speech after speech after speech, and it's him talking. We have the very beginning of the book starting, these are the words that Moses addressed to all of Israel on the other side of the Jordan. And we have a few verses here of introduction, where they've been, what they've done. And then verse 5, on the other side of the Jordan, in the land of Moab, Moses undertook to explain or to interpret the Torah, this Torah, saying, quote, and then we get long speeches, okay? Now, this first speech actually goes all the way, let's see, there's a little bit of a break. Let's see, and chapter 5, where it again says Moses called to Israel, he's kind of, introducing again. But the main, then we have a few breaks here and there where it'll say, and God spoke, or Moses spoke, going back to a third person. But anyway, so we have, for example, in chapter 4, verse 41, we suddenly have a reversion to third person. We say something about Moses setting up the cities of refuge. Okay, and in chapter 5 at the beginning, we have then again Moses calling to Israel, and we have more quote and more speeches. Okay, even in chapter 5, where we have the full text of the 10 Commandments. When in the book of Exodus, the 10 Commandments is told us something that happened. These are the words that God spoke to the nation of Israel. Here, if you look at chapter 5, verse 5, Moses is speaking himself. He says, I stood between the Lord and you at that time to convey the Lord's words to you. For you were afraid of the fire and did not go up on the mountain, saying, and now he's going to quote the entire text of the 10 Commandments, but it is inserted as a quote in his speech. Okay. So first of all, before we get into it, and we're going to basically be focusing on chapter 1 today, because there's a few wonderful examples of chapter 1 of this whole issue that makes Deuteronomy so different and so special. The fact that this is Moses' speech and what that means for us. But if we look at the entire perspective, okay, first of all, some people, or many commentators have questioned this whole idea. What do you mean the whole book is Moses' words? We thought that the Bible is supposed to be God's word, okay? So how do we, and in fact, there are people who went so far as to say Deuteronomy is not a godly book, it's written by Moses. Just look, it says, this is what Moses said. And of course, we don't believe that, because we believe that the book of Deuteronomy is included in the Bible, which means that it, like the 4 books preceding it, were books that had the divine imprimatur. This was something that God wrote or God dictated. This is not a book that, Moses decided to write himself a nice book. What does he want to tell the nation of Israel before he dies? And there are a number of different commentaries about this. And I think one of them, and one that to me makes the most sense, it's a opinion that was most famously put forward by a medieval commentator named Abarbanel. He was actually a Spanish Jew, had a very interesting, very difficult life, actually. He was originally in Portugal, and he was expelled from Portugal. He was in Spain. He was very high-ranking. He was the Minister of Finance for Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, just prior to the expulsion of the Jews in Spain. And despite his very, very high position, at the point at which they decided they were expelling the Jews, there was nothing to do about it, and he too was expelled. So here's somebody who was, very, very educated person. He was a Bible scholar. He was also one of the smartest economists of his time. Anyway, he takes a look at this, and he says the following. He says, yes, these in fact were Moses' speeches. He said them himself. He initiated them. They are his own words. They reflect his own feelings. They reflect what it is he wants to say to the nation. But the fact that they were put in the Bible means that God put his stamp on these messages. He says, yes, I want these messages in the Bible because these messages are important. Moses, my servant, God says, Moses, my servant, has said these speeches, and these are valuable speeches, and I want them to go into the Bible. And that's very, very important. If you think about it for a moment, is it really so different from any kind of quoted statements that we find in the first 4 books? You have many conversations that are quoted. I'll give you just one example that is quite a lot of dialogue. When the brothers, Joseph's brothers, go down to Egypt, all the interaction between Joseph and his brothers on the various times they come down, and especially towards the end when Judah stands up and gives his great monologue, it's there word for word, quoting what they said. Okay, so can you say that Judah wrote it? No, Judah didn't write the Bible, but the Bible's quoting Judah word for word because the Bible, that God believes that this is something we need to be reading and this is something we need to be studying. So this is just the same idea on a much grander scale. Okay, it is practically the whole book of Deuteronomy. Okay, so first of all, I wanted to set that stage with that because this means that the way we view Deuteronomy is different. One of the questions that has arisen is in the course, the first few chapters of Deuteronomy is very often referred to as the historical speech. There are 2 main types of speeches that Moses is giving. The first few chapters, the minority of the book, is what we call the historical speech. And this is when Moses basically reviews events going from his appearance on the stage, beginning in Egypt and the Exodus from Egypt, and going up to this very point. Now, of course, he doesn't review all the events. He reviews some. He reviews those that he wants to remind them of. Perhaps he has a message about them. And so as part of this, he's retelling events that we've already read about in previous books. And many commentators have noticed, and I'm sure you've noticed the same, is that there's some seeming contradictions or differences in the way a particular story is told. And that has created a lot of discussion. And of course, the Bible critics go to town on this and say, you see, this is one version of the story, that's another version of the story. This shows that there's no divinity in the Bible, just a bunch of different people. One group of people wrote wrong. The 4 scholars theory, JD, E, and P. Okay, well, I don't ascribe to that theory. I do believe it is one book, and I believe it's a book that God dictated. So how then do we deal with these seeming contradictions? And again, there's many interpretations on this. I'm going to just present a perspective that I feel comfortable with, but there are many different ones. And the way I look at it, it all comes back to the very same thing. The difference between Moses telling his own personal story. In Deuteronomy, what we have is we have Moses involved for the first time. And we have him involved all the way before. But Moses did not tell the story. He is an actor in the story. The story is told until now third person, which means it is written by God. And God is selecting what of the activities and the events that happen are the message that God wants in those first 4 books. When it comes to Deuteronomy, we have Moses' own personal perspective. And you can imagine when something happens to you, let's say you were walking down the street and you witness a burglary in downtown, wherever, okay? And it's exciting and you see the burglar run in and he steals and he comes out and then there's police and there's a chase and there's sirens and there's a whole lot of things going on at the same time, okay? Now, you're standing there, you have a particular perspective, and when you go home, you're going to tell your friends or your relatives whatever you saw and how you felt about it. How your heart was thumping and, oh my gosh, are they going to catch the guys, whatever. The next morning, you may read about the same event in the newspaper, and it's going to have a completely different perspective. Now, you won't necessarily say that perspective is wrong. You might say, yeah, that also happened, but you may also feel that it's missing something because it's missing your perspective. And this, I think, is what we're dealing with. Two different perspectives telling the same story. And not just two different perspectives, but two different agendas, two different objectives. The third person narrative is clearly, it's for the people of that generation, but much more for posterity. This is the way we need to view these stories. And there's many, many details that are included, but we can also assume many details that are excluded because they're not relevant. There is a message. God has an agenda. He wants to teach us different things in the different stories. And details that are not going to be relevant to that agenda will be left out. They're not important. Okay? However, when Moses is speaking to the nation, he has a completely different agenda. His agenda is, what am I going to convey to the nation of Israel in these last weeks before I die, which are also the last weeks before this nation is going to enter into a completely new reality. They are going to be entering the land of Israel. Well, that is a whole different spin. Moses has a different agenda, and he's also going to be viewing events from his own personal perspective. Both of these things are going to play a role. Okay, so let's start. I have two different examples from chapter 1 that I would like to focus on today. Okay, so first of all, we'll chapter 1, verse 6. We saw verse 5 is where there's the introduction. This is how Moses starts his talk. And we start with verse 6. The Lord our God spoke to us at Horeb. Now, Horeb, if you recall, is just another name for Sinai. Spoke to us at Horeb, saying, you have stayed long enough at this mountain. Start out and make your way to the hill country of the Amorites. So this very words, the beginning of these words, you have stayed long enough. You get a sense of impatience, okay? You're sitting around on Sinai, get going already. There's something urgent about this, okay? Now, what is this referring to? This is referring to something that actually happened in the book of Numbers, chapter 10. But there we don't have any sense of urgency or impatience. All we have is in chapter 10, verse 11, we have a very, very mild, uneventful description. In the second year, on the 20th day of the second month, the cloud lifted from the tabernacle of the testimony, and the Israelites set out on their journey from the wilderness of Sinai. Okay? It just tells us there's no emotion. There's no, nothing. It's just telling us that this is what happened. Now, if we paid attention to the date here, we saw it's in the second year in the second month. Okay? The nation of Israel has arrived at Sinai, the original Mount Sinai, okay? They left Egypt in the first month, and they arrive at Sinai in the third month, okay? So that procession is very quick. They leave Egypt in a hurry. They have a number of different travels. They have a war against Amalek and Rephidim. They have a few other places, and within 2 short months, they're already at Sinai, and they're receiving the law at Sinai. And then they stay there for a whole year, almost a whole year, from the third month of the first year to the second month of the second year, okay? So you can understand how, looking back, okay, there's this sense of urgency. Okay, we've been sitting in place. What were they doing that whole time? Well, they got the tablets the first time, and then they had the golden calf, and then they got the tablets the second time, and they built their tabernacle. And it's only after they built their tabernacle, and then at the beginning of Numbers, they organized themselves, and they did a census, and they figured out the camps, and who goes where, and how do you march, then they're ready to go. Took a year of a lot of stuff, okay? But it's all a year of things standing in place. So here, Moses looking back, he's expressing impatience. All right, guys, you got to go. Now, he probably was not impatient then because they were busy. They were doing things. There wasn't a complaint going on. Maybe God said, okay, guys, time to go. But here you have this sense of impatience that Moses is communicating. And you have to think that maybe his perspective on that first time of let's get going is influenced by what happened since. Now, what did happen since? Okay, we know that what happened since is that they did not really get going in the second year and move into the land of Israel within a few weeks. Instead, they started moving, and then they got to Kadesh Barnea, and then they sinned with the sin of the spies and ended up wandering in the desert for 38 years. And what Moses is doing now is he's looking back over 38 years, and then, of course, he has a sense of impatience. Okay? And as he looks back on the events that happened then at Sinai, I'm not sure he felt impatience then, but looking back now, and he's saying, he's already reflecting a sense of impatience then that may not have been quite felt at that time. But as he has this perspective now, after 38 years of patience, waiting and waiting, there's no question this is probably colored his perspective. Okay, now let's look at verse 9. And here we have a real question that comes up, because when he's now telling us of event, and we're going to have a hard time figuring out exactly what event he is referring to. He starts out by saying in verse now, and therefore I said to you, I cannot bear the burden of you by myself. Okay? Keep in mind those sentences, because we met those sentences another time. Okay? But we're going to go back and find out where there is. But let's just see what he says here. He starts out as if he said to the nation. Moses is recalling, I said to you, nation. Okay? I cannot bear the burden of all of you by myself. And then he goes on. He then, on verse 12, he has it even more poignantly. How can I bear? How? He's got this word echa in Hebrew. Very interesting, by the way. Echa is like, in Hebrew, the word for how is ech. Echa is seen as a just more poetic, more poignant way of saying echa. It is also the first word of the Book of Lamentations. And it works out that every single year we read the first chapter of Deuteronomy with this word in it, right before the 9th of Av, when we read the Book of Lamentations. So that's a very interesting thing that works out there. So basically what we're seeing there, almost when we read it and we hear it in our minds, we're hearing a mourning sense that Moses has, mourning over the nation of the nature of the nation of Israel. And of course, we, from a perspective of thousands of years later, can say, wow, all those sins that Moses experienced in the nation in the desert, it's those same sins, it's the same nature of the nation that gets us into trouble throughout our history, that brings upon us the punishment of the 9th of Av, which is what we will be actually commemorating this coming Sunday. Anyway, what he then does is he tells about the solution to his problem. He sets up different staff members, different groups of people who then take care of dealing with the disputes and the questions that arise from the nation. We have people assigned to every 10 group of people. Then we have an appellate court kind of thing with to every tens. We have to the thousands. We have for different groups of people. It's almost like it's like a court system that has an appellate situation, so that at the first instance you go to the people that are just in charge of 10 of you, and if they solve the problem, you're great, and if they don't solve the problem, you go up to the later instance. And this is a whole system. What's the problem here? The problem here is that this whole system of the officers of the tens and the 50s and the hundreds and the thousands was actually set up in the book of Exodus at the beginning of chapter 18. And it is presented there as something that Jethro, when he comes to visit Moses for the first time, he sees, if we look at Exodus chapter 18, verse 13, the day after Jethro arrives, next day Moses sat as a magistrate among the people, while the people stood about Moses from morning until evening. But when Moses' father-in-law saw how much he had to do for the people, he said, what is this thing that you are doing to the people? And he then suggests this whole system of dividing the people into these different groups and different staff that helps Moses out. And only the most difficult questions that are not able to be solved by these other people, only those questions come to Moses. So which is it? Is this a solution that came forward because of a discussion that Moses had with the nation? He came up with this idea. Or is this a solution that Jethro discussed? and suggested. So I would suggest that it is a combination. That basically what happened, if you go back to Exodus 18, Jethro is viewing Moses sitting there judging the nation from morning to night, and the nation is gathered around him. Okay? And then we see that Jethro makes the suggestion and Moses implements it. Now think about it for a second. The suggestion that Jethro makes to Moses, he makes to Moses. He doesn't announce it to the whole nation. The nation may never know how it is that Moses came up with his plan. Okay? It's very possible that as far as the nation is concerned, the nation is standing around Moses. Moses is like, what am I going to do here? Jethro whispers in his ear, gives them this idea. Moses' great idea, presents it to the nation. The nation says, great, and they implement it. Okay? So initially in the book of Exodus, this story is part of a general story that tells us about the greatness of Jethro. Jethro, who comes and as a person who's not an Israelite, comes to recognize the greatness of God, blesses God. He's a pagan, and he comes and he blesses God and recognizes God in the context of how amazing Jethro is and what he contributes to the nation of Israel. The most important thing to explain to us is the advice he gives to Moses. Here, however, when Moses is talking to the nation, whether the idea came from Jethro, came from him, is not relevant. The relevance is Moses is starting to introduce this whole theme that he's going to be taking through this whole chapter for sure. And that is, guys, you've been a pain in the neck. And it started way at the beginning when you were all massed around me and I just couldn't handle it. I couldn't handle it. And therefore we had to divide you up. But there's an element of criticism here. Whereas in Exodus, there's no criticism. It's just a lot of people that Moses has to deal with. He has to organize. Here, Moses is saying it almost as the beginning of criticism. He's not outwardly criticizing, but when he has this serious complaint, how can I bear unaided the burden of you, the trouble of you? This is more than a lot of people. This is a nation who's going to be a pain in the neck. And this is something that Moses is saying now. Now, actually, these exact words that I quoted to you here in verse 9, I cannot bear the burden of you by myself. These words themselves are actually said at a completely different time. In Numbers chapter 11, verse 14, okay? Now, what happens in chapter 11? Up until chapter 11, we're going well, okay? And then I think we talked about this when we discussed the Torah portion of Valotcha. In chapter 11 begins with things starting to deteriorate. People took to complaining bitterly before the Lord. And beginning with Numbers 11, we have a continuing deterioration until we end up with the sin of the spies. And of course, we all know that what happens there. That's it. The nation is punished. This whole generation will die out in the wilderness, and only the next generation will enter the land. But the roots of it, the beginning of that, deterioration in the nation starts in chapter 11. And it is in chapter 11, as a result of so much of this complaining, that Moses first says, and he says to God, by the way, he doesn't say to the nation. He says, I can't do this. And this is verse 14. It says exact same words. I cannot bear the burden of this nation myself. Okay? He says exactly the same thing. And here, God gives him an answer in the form of prophets or the elders who will also have the Spirit of God upon them and will assist him in leading the nation. It's a different problem. It has a different solution. And yet Moses borrows the same language to describe to the nation what actually happened with Jethro. When actually the thing happened with Jethro, he was not upset. He would never have used the words of bearing the burden, because at that point the nation is not yet a burden. But now when he's looking back and trying to again discuss what happened, he is influenced by this, what has happened with the nation. The nation has suddenly become a burden, and this is how he's seeing it today. I see we're running out of time, so I'm going to have to do this a little bit quicker. Okay, one more thing that I want to compare. Okay, we're getting in our chapter in Deuteronomy, verse 22. We start the story of the spies. And here it's a completely different beginning. We see here that Moses is saying the initiative to send the spies came from the nation itself. Then all you came to me and said, let us send men ahead to reconnoiter the land. When in fact, in Numbers 13, it is God speaking to Moses saying, you send forth these spies to the land. Okay? So again, there are, like Rashi, for example, very, very important commentator, combines the two. And he basically says, first the nation came to Moses. Moses didn't really know if that was a good idea or a bad idea. God said to him, yes, send it. And then at that time, it became a good idea, which we read in verse 23. I approved of the plan. He approved of the plan because God said to him, yes, you need to do it. And again, why isn't the conversation between God and Moses here? Okay, because the point of Moses' talk here is not about his relationship with God. It is about his relationship with the nation. He's talking about their interactions and what happened from their interactions and how it led to all these various things. But here in this situation, I think we can see the actual progress. Okay, now when he talks about them, he says the following. Look at verse 26. And you rebelled against the word of the Lord your God, and you sulked in your tents, and you said, is it because the Lord hates us? We have some very harsh language here that reflects anger, rebellion, hatred. They think God hates them. This is very, very strong language to describe what was going on with the spies. If you go back to the original story in the book of Numbers, you're not going to see any of that language. The only anger in the story of the spies, as it's told in Numbers, is the anger of God to the nation of Israel. Moses' entire role in that story is to try to beg God to have mercy on the nation. He is trying to reduce God's anger. There is absolutely no anger expressed coming from Moses at that point. Now, what we do see here, though, is something that it actually creates. I have always questioned this, and I think it's a huge question. And he tells this whole story, continues the story about the spies, and then he says a very interesting statement in verse 37. Because of you, the Lord was incensed with me too. And he said, you shall not enter it either. Now, the way this verse is said, it sounds as if Moses is actually receives his punishment not to go into the land over the sin of the spies. When we know that's absolutely not true. Moses was punished not to go into the land much later on. And already in the next generation, when after Miriam had died and there was no water, and God says, go to the rock and speak to the rock and water will come out. And there is something, and we discussed this a few weeks ago, something goes on. It's not exactly clear why God is angry at Moses, but he's angry at Moses. Okay, and as a result, it is there for the first time that God says to Moses and to Aaron, you too will not enter the land of Israel. So how is it that Moses puts it here as if it is a direct result or part of the sin of the spies? The same time that the nation is told they can't enter the land, Moses is also told he can't enter the land. And I think that the answer to this is in this language of anger. At that point in Numbers, wherever it was, I forgot. In Numbers, where we have the story of this whole thing, we have there, and this is one of the things that I discussed before. He says to them, "Listen to me, you rebels," and it's a very angry turning to the nation of Israel at the time with the rock and the hitting the rock and all that. He is angry. We meet an angry Moses, and whatever it is he has done wrong, it is coming from angry and impatience with the nation of Israel. And I think here, here I see where it is. That is Numbers 20, verse 10. Listen here, you rebels. He addresses the nation with anger. And I think in that way, what's actually happening here, he's saying to the nation, how did I get so angry? How did I get so angry? I brought myself to a situation there in front of the rock that I was angry, and that is how I ended up with this punishment. But what brought me to that anger? All of these sins, all of the how could I carry this burden myself? The burden of a nation that he has been shepherding for 40 years in the desert, and he has he is impatient. He has lost patience with them. He has been angry with them. And I think this is something we see here in this speech. Moses' perspective and how he looks back at the previous events is colored by what has happened over these 40 years, particularly, and we see his lack of patience and see his anger, and to the extent that he even blames the nation themselves for the fact that he too cannot go into the land of Israel. And I think if we're just to summarize this, and I think we're going to continue seeing this as we continue studying in the book of Deuteronomy, this is what we need to keep in mind. Moses' perspective. And Moses' perspective is very, very important because Moses is the leader of the nation. And he, from a very human place, is going to be urging the nation to obey God. He's going to be urging the nation to understand what is important, what they must keep in mind. And it is essential that we not only get the perspective from God, which is up there somewhere sometimes, but we are able to get the perspective of Moses, the leader, the man who was the ultimate intermediary between God and the nation of Israel. That's what I have to say today. Any questions, comments? I have time. Those of you who don't, feel free to sign out. But if anyone has anything to say, I'm happy to hear it.
Yes, please, Sondra. Two things. Was Moses foretold from God that he was going to be dying imminently?
Yes, a few times. Yes. A few times he knows that he's coming to the end. Already at the end of the book of Numbers, he has already appointed Joshua as his successor based on God's word. We see also at the end of Numbers is a point at which he goes all the way up to Mount Nebo already, or God tells him he will go up to Mount Nebo and he will see the land, and God says to him, but this land you will not enter. And then he knows it's right away. And the way the book of Deuteronomy opens, he says, we're about to go in, and of course, as the book proceeds, he tells them this, but he doesn't know maybe the exact date at that point, but he does know that the time is ending. And don't forget, God had said very specifically at the end of the sin of the spies, he said that they will wander in the land for 40 years. Well, it's been 40 years.
I see. And also, I think that it's purposeful that the Torah shows that Moses has an anger, because we have to always remember, as superb as he was as a Jew, there's still a line between the greatness of God and Moses. So it shows his humanity. Absolutely. He was very human, very much human. And I think what you point out is very good. Not just that he's not God, which is very important. We'll see at the very end of Deuteronomy where it says that, nobody knows where his grave is. No. And there's a sense like he died. God buried him, it seems, because he went up alone. Okay. But the idea is that he never had a shrine. No, God did not want Moses to turn into a god. Yes. That people would honor and revere and, go to his shrine or whatever. Moses was an intermediary, but the necessity for a human intermediary is just, it speaks volumes and that's what we have in Deuteronomy. We have Moses's passions, his anger, his excitement, his gratitude, his concern, his fear for the nation. It's so important. That's what Deuteronomy, I think, is really all about. This human connection between the totally divine of the first 4 books and the continuation of the story that becomes much more natural. Thank you very much.
Actually, I don't see that Moses. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Actually, I don't really see that Moses is angry when he spoke about how can I bear you because of verse 11. May the Lord God of your fathers make you 1,000 times more numerous than you are, and bless us. And bless you as he has.
What I'm trying to explain, I don't think that he's angry now, but as he's going back and reflecting on the challenge, he inserts anger. How can I bear you? You're a burden. Okay, he uses language that he never used earlier. But he used only that language of referring to the nation of Israel as a burden. We only see starting in Numbers 11, not before. That was my
Yeah.
point. Okay, anybody else want to say anything?
Yes, please.
A quick question. There's a
Sure, Rick.
somewhere about the death of Moses being by the mouth of God.
Yeah.
I've been looking for it here, trying to find it, but I can't locate it.
Okay, well, Moses dies.
Yeah.
Let's see. It doesn't say, but yeah, it says here. It's Deuteronomy 34, verse 5. So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab at the command of the Lord. Okay, but the literal word is alpi, by the mouth of the Lord. So it's interpreted as being by the word of the Lord or at the command of the Lord. Okay, and this is something there's this Jewish tradition. I mean, what happened? Moses went up. He just died. There was no one with him, right?
Right.
And there's something. There's a Jewish tradition that says that God kissed him.
Yes.
Yes.
And it was a death of the kiss of God.
Yeah.
And indeed, when people speak today about people dying a peaceful death at a very old age, like someone who dies in their sleep, they talk about it as a death of the kiss.
Yeah, but
When Moses died.
There wouldn't be a connection between that and the expression, the kiss of death.
Well, the kiss of death is usually a negative expression.
Yeah, exactly. That's what
I don't know. I have no idea. We can check that out. What what the origin of that kiss of death is. I have no idea. That's fascinating. I never thought of that. But in Hebrew, when you say mitat nishika, a death of a kiss is a very, very positive connotation. Peaceful.
Yes, exactly.
It's that God came and took you to himself, in a very personal way when your time had come.
Yeah, that's the way I want to go.
Oh, don't we all? Don't we all? All right. Anyway, have a great Shabbat. This Sunday is the 9th of Ab. Those of you who follow things in the Jewish calendar, it's a day of mourning and reflection over the destruction of both temples in Jerusalem, Solomon's temple and later Herod's temple, and which both happened on the same day, by the way. And it's also a day that we reflect about centuries of anti-Semitism and suffering of the Jews. It's just a day that if this is a day you want to kind of look into what is anti-Semitism, that's the day to do it. Anyway, have a wonderful weekend. Next week we will reserve on Thursday after this very sad day in a very happy mood.
Yeah.
Okay?
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom to you all.
I hope you enjoyed that video, and we'd like to be sure you're getting all of our video content. So just click on the subscribe button below as well as on the notification bell, and that way you will have easy access to all our material. We look forward to staying in touch with you. God bless you and have a wonderful day.